The Motte and Bailey is an argumentative move that people make in order to avoid criticism and to maintain a controversial position. The move was first explicitly identified by British philosopher Nicholas Shackle. The name is derived from the medieval Motte and Bailey castle, in which a highly protected, raised, stone-fortified keep, known as the Motte, is surrounded by a lower, enclosed courtyard protected by sharpened wooden palisades, and this is the Bailey. The idea behind the Motte and Bailey castle was that in the event of an attack, the townspeople in the more vulnerable courtyard or bailey could retreat to the higher, better fortified motte for protection. This could allow them then to more easily resist the attack from the vantage point of the raised motte. If the attack was successfully resisted from the position of the motte, then the occupants could return to the more vulnerable bailey and resume their regular day-to-day activities. When we move to the realm of argumentation, a similar dynamic often arises in the area of controversial topics. It occurs when someone switches between a motte, which is an easy to defend and often common sense statement, such as morality is influenced by culture, and a bailey, which is a harder to defend and more controversial statement, such as there is no such thing as objective moral truth, in order to defend the more controversial viewpoint. Someone will argue the easy to defend position, the motte, temporarily to ward off critics, while the more controversial position, the bailey, remains the desired belief and yet is never actually defended. The successful defense of the weaker and easier position is then claimed as evidence in support of the more controversial claim. The key here is what's known as equivocation, which is covered in another lesson. In the context of the Motte and Bailey fallacy, equivocation is used in a very specific way. The person wishes to defend a more controversial, less easy to defend interpretation of a phrase or a position. This is the bailey. However, they know that if they make this explicit, they will find it more difficult to defend. So whenever someone challenges their actual controversial belief, the person retreats to the safe and easy to defend interpretation, and that is the motte. They then rebuke or ridicule their critics for having been naive enough to think that they were trying to defend anything other than this more common sense interpretation of the phrase or position in question. When the critics retreat and give up their criticism, the person then equivocates and returns to endorsing the more controversial interpretation, the bailey. They then have the luxury of switching back and forth between the two interpretations to suit their circumstances. The controversial position when they're among like-minded people, for example, and then the innocent, more common sense position when they're confronted by critics. Let's take two examples of this, one from the political left and one from the political right. In the contemporary context, political conservatives typically endorse tighter restrictions on immigration than non-conservatives. In some cases, they will claim that the reason we need tighter restrictions on immigration is in order to keep out potential terrorists or criminals, or that they only want to keep out illegal immigrants. Now, most people, even those on the left, would support keeping potential terrorists and even criminals from entering the country whenever it's possible. However, some conservatives use this motte position, it's the common sense position, as a cover or smokescreen for what they really intend, namely, for example, that all people from certain countries should be kept out. So they might say, don't you want to keep terrorists and criminals from entering our country? Are you so naive as to think that no terrorists or criminals want to infiltrate and attack us, for example? If their critics then concede and back down, they'll switch back then to pushing the more controversial position, such as prohibit all Muslims from entering the country, or we need to preserve the native ethnicity and prevent it from becoming a minority. Whatever your beliefs about immigration, it's obvious that the latter are much more controversial and contentious claims. And clearly defending the fairly mundane idea that we should try to keep out criminals and terrorists from entering the country is not sufficient to establish the truth of these much more controversial claims and positions. When it comes to the political left, one example of a Motte and Bailey fallacy comes in the form of the defund the police slogan associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. On its face, the slogan appears quite radical and understandably controversial. When people started to question or push back against this particular slogan, many who had been endorsing it simply claimed that they were really only advocating for relatively uncontroversial or common sense reforms like reducing the militarization of police forces, reducing the amount of money spent on military-grade munitions, or simply redirecting some of the funding from policing to social programs. This would then disarm some of the critics. However, as soon as the criticism subsided, many of those endorsing the slogan then switched back to much more radical and controversial interpretations, advocating for the actual abolition of police forces, either in certain states or indeed across the entire United States, calling for the immediate 100% defunding of police departments. Again, whatever your beliefs about the rightness or feasibility of such policies, it's clear that successfully defending a reduction or redirection of funding does not entail abolition or 100% defunding. This is a clear example of a Motte fallacy. Notice that neither of these examples is intended to show that the more controversial conclusions are necessarily themselves false. It is simply to show that this way of arguing for the conclusions does not work. What is the motivation behind the Motte fallacy? Why is it so common? Well, it's not that difficult to discern. Firstly, it's a way to avoid having to actually defend more controversial claims that are obviously much more difficult to defend. Secondly, in some cases, it can successfully bamboozle or deceive people into supporting something that they do not in fact support. In other words, it can be a way of trying to covertly smuggle a certain policy position or political movement into mainstream acceptance without having to do the necessary intellectual groundwork of rationally defending that position or movement. It should again be clear that this fallacy can be deployed in the service of positions at any point along the political spectrum.